The weight of living under a forged identity in the medieval world was like carrying a noose around your neck every waking hour. From the moment a spy stepped into hostile territory, his life became a performance where every breath had to align with a story he invented. One slip of the tongue, a word pronounced with the wrong regional accent, or detail forgotten in a fabricated family history could unravel everything. And in those days, exposure was not followed by arrest or a fair trial. It was followed by shackles, fire, and blades. The cost of a mistake was always blood. Imagine entering a bustling medieval marketplace, pretending to be a cloth merchant from a distant town. The air is thick with the smell of leather, roasted meat, and horse manure. Every merchant calls out their wares. Every beggar pulls at sleeves. In this chaos, someone casually asks about your hometown. It seems innocent, but it is a test. If you hesitate for even a heartbeat before giving a convincing answer, naming the right streets, the right church bells, the right noble who rules there, you are doomed. In a world where memory was sharp and travel was rare, everyone knew their village intimately. To improvise was nearly impossible, and spies lived with the terror of being unmasked at the slightest question. The spy's disguise was not only external, but had to penetrate his very bones. He could not just wear a different cloak or carry forged documents. He had to transform into another man entirely. He needed to know how peasants held their spoons, how soldiers cursed when drunk, how monks whispered Latin verses, how merchants weighed coins on their palms. Every gesture, every habit, every small reflex was scrutinized by eyes sharpened by suspicion. In taverns, laughter could be a trap. A joke told the wrong way, a toast made with the wrong gesture, could brand him an outsider. The medieval world was unforgiving, its communities tight-knit, its customs brutally enforced. What makes this existence even more suffocating is that a spy could never let his guard down, not even in private. When he closed his eyes at night, the mask could not slip, because servants and innkeepers were always listening, always reporting. There were eyes in every corner, from monks to beggars, all of whom might sell a rumor for a loaf of bread or a mug of ale. A single careless word muttered in sleep could become a death sentence. Some spies trained themselves to dream silently, to bite their tongues when their minds betrayed them. Living as another man required strangling your own identity until you could barely remember who you once were. The paranoia seeped into the body. Heartbeats raced at every knock on the door. The sound of armored boots on a stone floor made sweat bead at the temples. Even the laughter of children could be twisted into menace because, in the medieval age, a child could innocently repeat something overheard at home and deliver a spy straight to the gallows. To be a spy was to be haunted not just by enemies, but by silence, by whispers, by the weight of pretending to belong where you did not. And the irony is that the more convincing you became, the more isolated you were. To play your role perfectly meant you could never risk revealing your true self, not even to those who showed kindness. Every smile might hide suspicion, every shared meal might conceal poison. There were countless stories whispered in the chronicles of spies who vanished into their disguises, so much so that they could not return to their old lives. One such tale spoke of a man who pretended to be a mason in a foreign city for over a decade, feeding secrets back to his king. When the war ended and he was recalled, he refused to leave. He no longer remembered his old name, no longer felt loyalty to the crown that sent him. He had become his disguise so completely that his original life was a ghost to him. This was the true horror, the slow erosion of identity until the spy himself did not know where the lie ended and the truth began. Every moment under false identity was a gamble, and the stakes were always mortal. Unlike knights, spies had no armor of steel, only armor of lies. Unlike lords, they had no castles to retreat into, only shadows and taverns. Their greatest weapons were silence, memory, and the ability to wear another person's skin like it was their own. But when the mask cracked, when suspicion crept in, their fates were not merciful. To be exposed was to be dragged into dungeons where truth was ripped out with iron hooks and burning coals. The mask that once protected them became the reason for the cruelty they suffered, because traitors and deceivers were not seen as enemies of an army, but enemies of honor itself. And so spies walked like ghosts among men, breathing lies with every word, convincing themselves that survival depended on erasing their own reflection. They lived deaths in slow motion, every day cut by fear, sharper than swords. To inhabit another's life was not an act of theater, but a pact with death, where the stage was the battlefield and the audience demanded blood if the performance faltered. Yet the true nightmare was not just the threat of discovery, but the knowledge that even if you survived another day, you had to wake up and keep performing endlessly until the mask fused with your skin and the man beneath was gone forever. Would you endure that silence, that erasure, that endless performance, knowing that the very walls and objects around you might be hiding the next secret meant to either protect or destroy you? In the medieval world, the art of hiding messages was not just clever, it was a matter of survival. A spy could not simply walk across enemy lines with a scroll in his pocket. Parchment was bulky, and words written in plain ink were death warrants if discovered. So information was smuggled through methods that transformed ordinary objects into weapons of secrecy. A loaf of bread might conceal a strip of parchment baked into its crust. A hollowed-out candle could hide a rolled-up message within the wax, revealed only after the flame melted it down. Even prayer books carried secret codes between the sacred lines of scripture, invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. To live in this world was to look at everything with suspicion, to wonder whether a rosary bead or a wine flask might whisper more than its surface suggested. The ingenuity of these hidden messages was breathtaking. One common method was invisible ink, crafted from simple household substances like vinegar, lemon juice, or milk. When applied to parchment, the writing seemed to vanish, leaving a blank page. Only when the paper was heated over a candle flame would the letters reappear, their faint brown lines carrying secrets that could topple kingdoms. But this method was not foolproof. If the parchment burned, the information was lost forever, and if an enemy suspected the trick, they could reveal the writing with the same ease. It was a dangerous gamble, but one worth taking when lives and wars depended on a few hidden words. More elaborate deceptions involved carving messages into objects meant to pass unnoticed. A wooden comb could carry shallow etchings along its spine, readable only to those trained to recognize the pattern. Knots tied into ropes were used as a form of code, each loop and twist representing a letter or number. Merchants, traveling with bolts of cloth, sometimes wove threads of different colors and subtle patterns, creating tapestries that appeared decorative but were, in truth, encrypted texts. The beauty of these methods was that they blurred the line between art, craft, and espionage, making it impossible to separate the ordinary from the deadly. Yet for every brilliant method, there was always the terror of discovery. Picture a spy posing as a peddler walking through a crowded city gate with a basket of apples. To the guard, it is just food, nothing worth noting. But inside one apple, hollowed carefully and sealed with wax, lies a message with the names of enemy informants. If the fruit is dropped, if the wax seal cracks, if the guard becomes suspicious and cuts into it, the deception is revealed and the spy's life ends in an instant. Every step across those cobblestones is a step on a tightrope, with death waiting at the bottom. There were also codes woven into the very words of everyday speech. A simple letter, home to a wife or brother, might appear to be about harvests or livestock, but each word could hide a pattern. The first letter of each sentence, when read in sequence, might spell out a location. The count of words in each line could reveal a date. This kind of steganography, where meaning was hidden within the mundane, required immense discipline. A spy had to compose entire letters of false affection, false complaints, false joys, while making sure the real message survived beneath the mask. And if his enemies suspected, they could force him to write the same letter again. One inconsistency, one misplaced word, the lie unraveled. Curiously, not all secret messages were written at all. Some were sung. Traveling musicians, minstrels, and bards were among the most effective couriers of information, their verses carrying double meanings that only certain ears could decode. A ballad about a knight's victory might actually contain instructions for troop movements. A love song could mask the description of a castle's weak defenses. The brilliance of this system lay in its fluidity. Songs could be memorized and altered, leaving no incriminating parchment to be found. But the danger was immense, because once suspicion arose, the bard's loot would not save him from the rack. Even the objects most associated with faith were corrupted into tools of espionage. Rosaries with beads that could unscrew, crucifixes with hidden compartments, pilgrim badges concealing folded slips of parchment. The church was everywhere in medieval life, and with it came opportunities for spies to pass undetected under the veil of holiness. But to be caught hiding treachery in sacred symbols was to invite not just execution, but damnation in the eyes of the people. Few punishments were more brutal than being branded a blasphemer as well as a traitor. The sheer creativity of these secret methods might seem admirable from a distance, but for the men and women who lived them, each trick was a razor's edge. To hold a candle with a message inside was to feel its weight like a stone tied to your neck. To sing a song that was really an encrypted order was to gamble that your audience was ignorant, that no suspicious lord was listening from the shadows. For every successful delivery, countless failures rotted in dungeons, their ingenuity serving as nothing more than evidence against them. And yet, spies kept inventing, kept hiding words in places no one thought to look, because in their world, silence was a greater danger than risk. If no messages moved, armies starved, alliances collapsed, and kingdoms crumbled. These fragile scraps of information, hidden in apples, books, songs, and beads, carried the weight of entire wars on their shoulders. But even the cleverest code or the most ingenious disguise could not protect them once suspicion took root, and a spy found himself in the iron grip of capture. To be captured as a spy in the medieval world was not just to face death, but to descend into a realm of agony where the body and soul were torn apart long before the final breath. Armies and kingdoms could tolerate soldiers who fought openly, even when they were enemies, but a spy was something different, something despised. He was a deceiver, a liar who crept in shadows, striking not with sword or lance, but with whispers and betrayal. For that, there was no mercy. Once suspicion gave way to certainty and the mask of false identity was ripped away, the spy's fate became inevitable. Torture was not only a possibility, it was an expectation, a ritual, and often a spectacle designed to extract truth and instill terror. The methods of torture varied from place to place, but their purpose was always the same: to force confessions, to expose accomplices, to strip the spy of every secret clinging to his tongue. The rack was perhaps the most infamous, a wooden frame with rollers at either end. The prisoner's wrists were tied to one side, ankles to the other, and then slowly, with deliberate cruelty, the handles were turned. Joints dislocated, muscles tore, bones cracked. A man could scream for hours, the sound echoing in stone chambers until it became a chorus of despair. And yet, silence was more dangerous. If a spy withstood the agony without revealing names or locations, the torturers would simply invent new torments until the body gave way. Iron devices multiplied in every dungeon. The strappado lifted prisoners by their bound wrists, suspending them in the air until shoulders wrenched from their sockets. The iron boot crushed legs with wedges hammered between boards. Heated pincers ripped flesh, while branding irons burned confessions directly into the skin. For some, tongues were torn out to prevent further lies, though this often came only after names were already dragged out through other means. To witness such brutality is horrifying, even centuries later. But in the medieval world, these scenes were daily realities in castles and town squares. A spy who was captured knew with certainty that his body would become a canvas of pain, painted stroke by men trained in cruelty. What makes this more haunting is that the torturers themselves were rarely angry or emotional. They were professionals, paid servants of justice, often proud of their work. To them, tearing secrets out of a prisoner was as ordinary as a smith hammering iron or a baker kneading dough. They had tools for every purpose, every angle of the human body, every scream that could be drawn out of a throat. Some even kept records of how long a prisoner lasted under each device, as if measuring endurance like a grim science. For a spy, this knowledge was unbearable. He was not even hated as a man, but treated as material, as a thing to be broken open until secrets spilled out. One chilling detail of medieval torture was the role of the public. Not all torments were hidden away in dungeons. Sometimes spies were questioned in open squares, where citizens watched their agony as both punishment and warning. To betray was to be humiliated as well as destroyed. A captured spy might be paraded through streets, mocked, spat on, beaten by children, before being tied to a frame where the community could witness his slow unmaking. These spectacles were designed not just to punish, but to sear fear into the memory of everyone watching. No one could mistake what awaited them if they chose the life of secrecy and deception. Yet even within this horror, there were moments of strange resilience. Chronicles tell of spies who endured unimaginable torments and never revealed a word. Some bit through their tongues to keep from betraying comrades. Others laughed in the face of their captors, choosing death over dishonor. Their silence became legends whispered in secret, proof that even the sharpest blade could not always carve out the truth. But these were rare, almost miraculous cases. The vast majority broke, spilling not only their own missions, but dragging entire networks into ruin. A single confession could unravel years of careful planning, exposing dozens of hidden agents who would then suffer the same fate. Torture did not end with one man. It spread like fire across everything he touched. There were also darker games within the torture chamber. Sometimes interrogators planted false mercy, pretending to believe a spy's lies in order to draw out even more details. They might promise freedom or leniency, only to record the confession and then continue the torment anyway. Others staged mock rescues or claimed that comrades had already betrayed him, pushing the prisoner into despair so deep he clutched at any chance to make the pain stop. For spies, this psychological cruelty was as terrifying as the iron itself. The body could resist for a while, but the mind, when twisted by hope and hopelessness together, often collapsed faster. The tragedy is that capture almost never ended with simple execution. Death would have been quick, merciful even. Instead, spies were forced to linger, dragged through layer after layer of torment until the body was unrecognizable. And when the torment ended, there was still the final act. The execution, carried out with the same theatrical cruelty that had begun in the dungeon. Hanging, burning, quartering, methods designed to make the spy's last moments as public and degrading as possible. His suffering was a message carved not just into his body, but into the memory of all who witnessed it. To live as a spy was to know that this fate was always waiting. Every knock on the door, every suspicious glance in a tavern, carried with it the shadow of the rack and the iron boot. Even if the mission was perfect, even if the disguise flawless, the knowledge of what capture meant haunted every step. A spy did not simply fear death. He feared the long road to death, paved with pain so exquisite it became a kind of living hell. And the cruelest truth of all was that sometimes the men who inflicted this horror were not strangers, but traitors from within, comrades who had already turned, dragging their fellows into the same nightmare. Betrayal within the very circle of trust was the deepest wound a spy could endure, and in the medieval world, it was not rare, it was expected. Espionage thrived on deception, but deception had no loyalty. A man could share bread with you in the morning, swear his undying allegiance by firelight, and sell your name to the enemy before nightfall. Gold was a powerful poison, and fear was an even sharper blade. Armies and kings knew that spies operated best, when they were not only hunted by their enemies, but stalked by suspicion from their own comrade. This constant uncertainty made every bond fragile, every conversation edged with paranoia. Imagine a network of spies gathered in a tavern cellar, maps unrolled, candles flickering, whispers heavy with danger. They speak of coded messages, troop movements, safe passages through enemy lands. Yet among them, perhaps one man has already been turned. He has slipped a coin purse into his cloak after a quiet meeting with a rival lord. Now every word spoken in that cellar is not a secret, but a trap. The very trust that gives the group strength becomes the dagger that will destroy it. When betrayal came, it was not with thunder and steel, it was with silence, with a sudden knock at the door and the sound of armored boots descending the stairs. History is littered with stories of treachery that turned missions into disasters. A single informant could undo years of delicate planning. In the Kingdom of France, there are accounts of spies who infiltrated English courts, only to be exposed by a fellow agent bribed with wine, women, and land. In Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, where politics were woven with shadows, betrayal was practically a profession. Families would plant double agents among their rivals, waiting until the most critical moment to let the betrayal surface. A spy who had given everything, his identity, his safety, his loyalty, might find himself handed over not by strangers, but by the very comrades he had protected. And betrayal did not always require money. Sometimes it was born from jealousy, resentment, or ambition. One spy might covet the recognition another received from their master, or believe he was risking more and gaining less. In such poisonous soil, suspicion blossomed. A whispered accusation could destroy reputations before the enemy even raised a hand. To accuse someone of treachery was to stain them permanently, because how could one prove loyalty in a world built on lies? A spy could be innocent and still be executed simply because another agent's word carried more weight. Perhaps the cruelest form of betrayal came when families were dragged into the game. A spy's brother, wife, or child could be captured and threatened. In exchange for their safety, the spy himself would be forced to betray his comrades. Worse still, sometimes it was the family member who chose survival over loyalty. A wife might reveal her husband's secrets under pressure, or a son might hand over his father to save himself. These stories were whispered among spies like ghost tales, not because they were rare, but because they were too common, each one reminding them that love itself could be twisted into a weapon. The betrayal did not end at the moment of capture. In dungeons, torturers exploited suspicion among comrades, feeding prisoners lies about each other. "He has already confessed," they would say, pointing to an empty cell. "Why should you suffer when he has already given you up?" Even the strongest men cracked under such manipulation, believing themselves betrayed and choosing to betray in turn. The web of loyalty unraveled strand by strand until a network that had once seemed unbreakable dissolved into dust. There is a chilling irony in how betrayal was sometimes rewarded. A spy who sold his comrades might receive a noble title, a parcel of land, or a permanent place in the enemy's court. But more often than not, once he had served his purpose, he was discarded. The new master never truly trusted him, for a man who betrayed once would surely betray again. Many who sold their allies for coin found themselves hanging from the same gallows as those they had delivered, their gold purse still in their pocket, proof of a bargain made too cheaply. This reality meant that spies lived in a constant state of doubt. They carried blades not just for the enemy, but for the man sitting beside them. They learned to sleep lightly, to keep their backs against walls, to never drink from a cup they had not poured themselves. Loyalty oaths were sworn on sacred relics, on blood, even on the bones of saints, but none of it guaranteed trust. The more elaborate the oath, the more fragile the bond often proved to be. The psychological toll was devastating. To know that every smile could hide a knife, every embrace could conceal betrayal, was to walk through life armored in suspicion. The mind of a spy was sharpened into paranoia, and paranoia bred mistakes. Sometimes betrayal did not even need to happen. The mere fear of it drove men to confess prematurely, to flee missions, or to turn on comrades who were in truth still loyal. In this way, betrayal was a weapon even when it existed only in the imagination. What remains most haunting about betrayal and espionage is how ordinary it was. It did not always come with dramatic scenes of treason or grand speeches about loyalty lost. More often it came in quiet moments. A hand taking a coin in the shadows, a name whispered into the wrong ear, a glance exchanged with a guard that lingered too long. The simplicity of betrayal was what made it so powerful. It required no swords, no armies, no battles, just one man's weakness, and an entire mission could collapse. And yet, even in this world of treachery, spies kept moving, kept plotting, because they knew that if betrayal from within did not destroy them, suspicion and violence from without surely would. To survive was to be armed not only with steel, but with a mind sharpened by fear, always watching, always doubting, never resting. And from that endless tension grew the paranoia that shaped every waking step of their lives, pushing them toward a state where even survival meant living like prey in a world full of predators. To live as a medieval spy was to carry the constant weight of suspicion, and with it came the instinct to be always armed, always wary, always watching shadows. Unlike knights or soldiers who wore their weapons openly as a symbol of strength, a spy's blade was hidden, quiet, and personal. A dagger strapped to the thigh beneath layers of cloth, a thin stiletto tucked into a boot, or even a sharpened quill that could pierce a throat if desperation demanded. These were not weapons of honor, but of survival. A spy knew that danger could come not from a battlefield, but from the man seated across a tavern table. And in that world, the line between life and death could be measured by the speed with which one's hand found steel. There was no resting in such a life. Every glance from a stranger, every question too casually asked, every step echoing in a narrow alley carried the potential for betrayal or ambush. To survive, a spy learned to read people with unnerving precision. He studied body language, the twitch of a hand toward a belt, the quick flicker of eyes toward an exit, the tightening of a jaw before a sudden attack. These were the small signals that meant the difference between slipping away alive or ending up face down in a puddle of blood. Suspicion was not just a feeling, it was an art, sharpened over countless nights of watching and waiting. The tavern was often the most dangerous place of all. There men loosened their tongues with ale and wine, but they also carried grudges and sharp blades. A spy might smile and laugh with strangers, but his fingers never strayed far from the hilt beneath the table. He drank slowly, cautiously, never too much, never enough to dull his senses. One sip too many could mean waking up with pockets turned out, secrets stolen, and a throat slit for good measure. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was necessary, because the medieval tavern was not only a place of warmth and cheer, it was a hunting ground for informants, assassins, and rival spies who thrived in the noise and chaos. Even on the road, danger lingered at every bend. A merchant's caravan might seem harmless, until one noticed that its guards carried more steel than goods. A group of pilgrims chanting prayers could easily hide blades beneath their cloaks. To a spy, there were no coincidences, no safe encounters, only questions. Why are they here? Who do they serve? What do they know about me? A moment of trust could mean being dragged from the saddle, bound in chains, and hauled off to the dungeons. And so, spies slept with weapons close at hand, blades laid beneath pillows, daggers buried in boots, their ears tuned to every crunch of gravel outside the door. The paranoia was not only external, it corroded the heart from within. To live constantly on edge was to feel every friendship strained, every alliance temporary. Even when surrounded by supposed allies, a spy would sit with his back to the wall, eyes scanning the room, searching for exit. Sleep came in fragments, broken by jolts of fear, by nightmares of betrayal, by the memory of comrades who had trusted too easily and paid with their lives. Suspicion was not a choice. It was a necessity carved into the bones, and without it, death would come swiftly. There were countless tricks spies used to protect themselves from sudden betrayal. Some never entered a room without noting at least 2 escape routes. Others never revealed their true lodging, keeping decoys and false addresses to confuse pursuers. Many carried poison hidden in rings or small vials, not only to use on enemies, but to swallow themselves if capture seemed inevitable. Better to die swiftly, they believed, than to endure the long agony of interrogation and the betrayal of others under torture. These measures might seem extreme, but in the brutal world of medieval espionage, they were the bare minimum required to survive another day. What makes this existence most chilling is how suspicion warped even ordinary acts. A smile from a stranger could be a lure. A shared meal might carry poison. An innocent question could be a test of identity. Even love became dangerous, because to trust someone fully was to hand them the power to destroy you. There are stories of spies who kept lovers but never revealed their real names, who fathered children that grew up not knowing the true man behind the mask. To be always armed and always suspicious meant living a life where intimacy was impossible, where even tenderness was filtered through the lens of doubt. The cruelty of this life was that it eroded humanity. The constant readiness to fight or flee hardened men into creatures of instinct, animals crouched in perpetual defense. They lived longer than their reckless counterparts, perhaps, but at a cost: isolation, fear, and the slow unraveling of the self. And still, they endured, because they knew that to let their guard down for even a moment was to invite the very fate they feared most. In this relentless existence, paranoia was not madness. It was survival, a blade sharper than any dagger they carried. But even those who lived by constant suspicion could not escape the shadow of mortality forever. For all their watchfulness, for all their hidden weapons and sharpened instincts, spies understood a brutal truth. Many would die before their missions were completed. The cloak of secrecy protected them only so long, and once it failed, the end was swift, bloody, and often forgotten. The tragedy was not merely dying, but dying with secrets still burning on their tongues, secrets that would vanish with them into the grave. For a medieval spy, death often came not as a heroic end on the battlefield, but as a cruel interruption, swift, unexpected, and before the mission's purpose was ever fulfilled. To be sent into enemy lands was to accept that survival was unlikely, yet the bitter truth was that most spies never lived long enough to deliver the messages they carried or see the consequences of their work. They were shadows walking into storms, knowing that at any moment the disguise, the code, or the route could fail. And when it did, their lives were extinguished with barely a whisper, leaving their secrets buried in silence. The most common fate was capture and execution before reaching the rendezvous point. Imagine a young spy disguised as a peddler trudging along a muddy road with a satchel of trinkets and a coded message hidden inside his belt. He rehearses his cover story with each step, whispers prayers to saints, and counts the distance to the next town. But then he is stopped at a checkpoint by soldiers sharper than expected. They ask questions about his village, questions he has prepared for, but a slip, a hesitation, betrays him. Before he can breathe, he is dragged from the road, his satchel overturned, his body bound. Days later, his corpse dangles from a gibbet at the town gates, his mission rotting with him. The message never arrives, the plan collapses, and his name is forgotten, reduced to nothing more than a warning to passers-by. Yet death did not always come from the enemy. Disease was a silent assassin that claimed many spies long before their secrets could be passed on. Medieval roads were treacherous with sickness, contaminated wells, pestilence-ridden inns, plague creeping through towns like an invisible fire. A spy might survive suspicion, survive betrayal, even survive blades at his throat, only to fall to fever in a cold tavern bed, clutching the message he had sworn to deliver. To die this way was perhaps less violent, but no less tragic. Kingdoms rose and fell depending on scraps of information, and when the courier died nameless and alone, the ripple of failure could alter the outcome of entire wars. There was also the brutal reality of exhaustion. The missions demanded more than strength of body. They demanded endless endurance of the mind. Sleepless nights spent listening for footsteps, weeks on the road hiding behind false identities, the constant gnaw of hunger and thirst. These eroded even the strongest men. A spy too weary to remain vigilant was already dead, his edge dulled, his mask slipping without him realizing. In this world, fatigue was fatal. A single missed cue, a moment of rest when eyes should have been watching, was enough to summon the dagger in the dark. Sometimes death came at the hands of those a spy was meant to trust. Betrayal was a toxin that flowed freely through networks of secrecy. A comrade bribed with silver or coerced with threats could turn a safe house into a trap, guiding soldiers to the very table where plans were whispered. To be killed by the enemy was expected, but to be murdered by a fellow spy, or worse, or delivered to torturers by the hands of one you considered a brother, was the most bitter death of all. Such betrayals shattered not only lives, but the very foundation of trust, making the survivors question whether anyone could be loyal in a world built on lies. And then there were the executions, staged as theater. Spies who were captured alive were often paraded before crowds, their deaths dragged out for spectacle, burnings at the stake, hangings from city walls, public beheadings. These were not just punishments, but performances, warnings etched into the memory of all who watched. A spy's mission ended, not with the success of information delivered, but with his body twisted in agony for others to see. His failure turned into a tool of fear. Some chronicles tell of spies who cursed their captors until the very last breath, shouting lies or defiance in an attempt to confuse and inspire. But most died silently, their lips sealed by pain, their work unfinished. What made these deaths especially tragic was their anonymity. Knights killed in battle had songs written of their valor, banners raised to honor their sacrifice. Spies, however, were rarely remembered at all. Their missions were secret, their names erased, their deeds swallowed by the shadows in which they lived. If they succeeded, credit went to kings and generals. If they failed, their lives ended in obscurity, their corpses disposed of as though they had never existed. They were ghosts in life and forgotten in death, expendable pawns in games of power that never acknowledged them. The irony of this existence was that spies often carried truths that could have changed the course of history, but when they perished, those truths perished too. Imagine a coded message detailing the betrayal of a noble locked in the fist of a corpse hanging from a tree. The king who needed that message never received it, and the traitor lived on, altering the balance of war. In this way, the death of a single spy could tilt the scales of kingdoms, not with heroism, but with silence. Their failure was not only personal but catastrophic, and yet the world rarely knew why events shifted, only that they did. And so, spies accepted that death would likely claim them before their tasks were done. It was not a matter of if, but of when. They walked into their missions with this knowledge carved into their bones, every heartbeat a countdown, every step, heavy with the awareness that they might not see another sunrise. Still, they moved forward, driven by loyalty, fear, greed, or desperation, because the shadow they served was larger than themselves. They became living sacrifices, offering their lives to causes that would never thank them. But the story of espionage did not end with death. Even as spies perished, others followed the same perilous paths, carrying messages through hidden routes, crafting disguises, and facing the same dread. For the world of shadows never ceased, and the roads that claimed so many lives were still traveled, dangerous as ever. Death was not an ending in espionage. It was part of the cycle, a grim inheritance passed from one spy to the next. And as long as men and kingdoms thirsted for secrets, the risk of dying before completing the mission would forever haunt those who dared to walk in the dark. The routes spies traveled in the medieval world were as dangerous as the missions themselves. Roads were not safe passageways, but veins pulsing with risk, filled with bandits, soldiers, tollkeepers, and suspicious villagers, ready to report strangers to their lords. Every journey was a calculated gamble, where even the smallest decision, whether to take the main highway or a forest trail, whether to lodge at a tavern or sleep in a barn, could decide between survival and discovery. For a spy, the road was never just a path. It was an arena where death could appear in a dozen different disguises. Disguises often dictated which route a spy could take. A pilgrim traveling toward a holy shrine might be allowed safe passage through guarded gates, his dusty cloak and scallop shell convincing others of his devotion. But to wear that disguise meant knowing the prayers, the rituals, and even the minor relics expected along the way. A single misstep, a forgotten verse, an error in the sign of the cross, could draw suspicion. Merchants, too, often served as covers. They carried goods in carts or packs, and their trade gave them excuses to cross borders and mingle with strangers. Yet such disguises required proof, coins from distant markets, knowledge of weights and measures, and familiarity with prices in foreign lands. Without these details, the disguise collapsed, and the road that was meant to provide freedom became a trap. Bandits posed another danger, one that cared little for politics. A spy carrying no obvious wealth might still be stripped, searched, and killed for mere sport. Tales abound of spies caught not by enemy soldiers, but by outlaws who stumbled upon the wrong parchment, the wrong seal, or the wrong hidden dagger. In such moments, the spy's mission was destroyed not by clever counterintelligence, but by the chaotic violence of lawless men. This randomness made the roads terrifying, for danger could come not from the crown or the church, but from hungry eyes in the forest. Then there were the tolls, both legal and corrupt. Medieval lords demanded payment for crossing their bridges or roads, and toll keepers were notoriously nosy. They would inspect goods, ask questions, and sometimes detain travelers under suspicion of smuggling. For spies, this meant preparing answers not only for noble courts, but for common guards at rickety wooden gates. Even the smallest encounter could spiral into exposure. Some spies carried false documents to wave at such barriers, forged seals and letters of passage that could convince illiterate guards they were traveling under noble protection. But if the forgery failed, discovery was immediate, and the spy's body might swing from a tree before nightfall. The geography of routes added another layer of peril. Forests were thick with shadows, echoing with wolves and whispers of ambush. Rivers could sweep away travelers, drowning secrets in their depths. Mountain passes forced spies into narrow paths where a single guard could control all movement. In winter, snowstorms could erase roads altogether, leaving travelers lost, starving, or frozen before they ever reached their destinations. To travel was to gamble against nature itself, and nature was as merciless as any executioner. To reduce risk, spies often relied on secret pathways known only to locals. Shepherd trails across hills, hidden fords across rivers, or tunnels beneath castles and towns. These routes were precious and guarded like treasure, passed down in whispers between those who risked their lives in shadows. Yet trusting such guides was itself dangerous. A shepherd who agreed to lead a stranger through the hills might just as easily deliver him to soldiers for a pouch of coins. The spy could never be certain if his helper was loyal, greedy, or both. And so, even as they walked side by side, the spy's hand hovered near his blade, ready for betrayal at any turn. There were also places deliberately built for secrecy. Some monasteries acted as safe havens, their stone walls sheltering travelers who arrived under the guise of holy pilgrims. But not all monks were loyal. Some were spies themselves, serving kings as eyes behind cloisters. Taverns, too, became nodes of information. They stood at crossroads, collecting news from merchants, soldiers, and wanderers. For a spy, taverns were both lifelines and traps, a place to overhear valuable intelligence, but also a stage where one wrong word could bring suspicion crashing down. The paranoia of travel was so consuming that even simple sounds on the road could trigger fear. The distant jingle of armor, the creak of wagon wheels, the bark of dogs in a village, each noise carried meaning, each one potentially the signal of exposure. Spies trained themselves to notice patterns, to count the steps between guard posts, to memorize the rhythm of bells that marked curfews. Their minds became maps, filled with invisible dangers, etched into every hill and stream. Travel was no longer freedom. It was a chessboard where every move was contested by forces unseen. Curiously, one of the most ingenious techniques was the use of traveling performers. Jugglers, acrobats, and musicians could pass through borders with little scrutiny, for they brought entertainment to nobles and peasants alike. Hidden within their songs or their props were often the secrets of kings, a coded ballad, a hollow lute, or a set of dice weighted to carry messages. Yet even this cover carried risk. If suspicion fell, the same crowd that once cheered could turn violent, seeing not joy but deceit in the eyes of the performer. What made these roads so deadly was not simply the obstacles themselves, but the crushing uncertainty. A spy never knew which turn in the road might lead to salvation, and which might lead to death. The tension was unrelenting, eroding the mind as much as the body. To walk the roads was to carry fear like a second skin, to move through the world knowing that every stranger might be an enemy, every path a trap. And yet, despite all of this, spies continued to walk these treacherous paths, carrying messages that shaped wars and toppled kingdoms. But to survive the road was only half the battle. Once inside the enemy's city walls, another ordeal awaited, the art of disguise, where a spy had to transform himself so completely that even his reflection could betray him. Disguise in the medieval world was not a matter of slipping into different clothes and hoping for the best. It was a full transformation, a shedding of the self until every gesture, every word, and even every silence belonged to someone else. A spy did not merely put on a cloak or hood, he became a new man. The success of his mission, and his very survival, depended on convincing others that the role he played was real, as natural as his own skin. To achieve this required preparation, observation, and the willingness to erase his identity until even he no longer knew where the lie ended and the truth began. The most obvious element of disguise was clothing. A spy who needed to pass as a peasant might wear coarse wool, stained and patched to show years of use. To pose as a merchant, he might carry scales and coins, with belts decorated in the fashion of the region he pretended to hail from. Nobles required finer fabrics, boots polished, and jewelry that reflected wealth and status. But these outward details were only the surface. Medieval society was obsessed with hierarchy, and everyone could read it instantly. A man in noble garments, who walked like a farmer, who bowed too deeply or too little, who failed to address lords with the proper honorific, would expose himself in an instant. Spies learned that to wear the clothing was easy, but to inhabit the mannerisms of a role was the true challenge. And one of the greatest weapons in the spy's arsenal was accent and dialect. In a time when villages were separated by only a few miles, the way one pronounced words marked them unmistakably. A single syllable out of place could betray a man's origin. Spies practiced endlessly to shape their tongues, mimicking merchants, monks, and soldiers, until they could pass among them. There are tales of infiltrators who spent weeks living with shepherds just to learn the cadence of their speech, because they knew a shepherd could spot an impostor faster than any guard. This obsession with sound turned language into a battlefield, and a spy's tongue could be as dangerous as a sword. Physical transformation was another tool. Some spies scarred their faces deliberately or shaved their heads to alter their appearance. Others darkened their skin with soot or herbs to appear weathered by the sun, or plucked teeth to match the poor condition of peasants. In Venice, a city notorious for espionage, false beards and wigs were common, crafted with such detail they could fool even close inspection. These changes were not mere vanity, but shields against recognition. Yet each disguise carried risk. A wig could slip, a false scar could smear, and once suspicion was aroused, no amount of fabric or makeup could save a man from the interrogation that followed. Religion offered another powerful mask. Pilgrims wandered across Europe by the thousands, and their presence raised few questions. A spy could don a pilgrim's badge and cloak, join a group traveling to Santiago or Rome, and pass through enemy lands with minimal scrutiny. But this role demanded knowledge of prayers, rituals, and relics. Pilgrims swapped stories of miracles and saints. To fail in this conversation was to risk exposure. And worse still, if discovered using the cloak of faith for espionage, the punishment was not only execution, but eternal damnation in the eyes of the church. Few disguises carried such peril, but few offered such freedom of movement. Even trades and professions became disguises. A mason might enter castles under the pretense of repairing walls while secretly sketching layouts for enemy generals. A wandering minstrel could charm lords with music while memorizing guard rotations. Physicians and healers were particularly effective disguises, for they were welcomed into the private chambers of nobles, where secrets spilled more easily than blood. But these roles required genuine skill. A false mason who could not wield tools, or a fake healer who misdiagnosed a fever, would be exposed swiftly, often fatally. The line between performance and reality blurred, and many spies became masters of crafts not for love of the work, but for love of survival. What makes disguise most fascinating is that it was never static. A spy often shifted identities multiple times on a single mission. He might enter a town as a merchant, travel the road as a pilgrim, and then slip into a castle as a servant. Each mask had to be convincing, and each demanded its own knowledge, behaviors, and risks. To carry so many identities was to carry immense strain. Some spies lost themselves in the process, forgetting their original voices, answering instinctively to names that were not their own. They became living phantoms, existing only through the illusions they spun. But no disguise, no matter how perfect, was truly safe. Suspicion was a constant predator, and people in the medieval world were naturally distrustful of strangers. A neighbor might question why your story shifted slightly, why you avoided certain foods, why you prayed differently. Even the smallest detail, mud on boots that did not match the claimed route, a coin from the wrong mint, could unravel months of preparation. Once doubt took root, the mask cracked, and the spy's world collapsed. The dagger beneath the cloak could defend against a sudden attack, but no weapon could silence suspicion once it spread through whispers and watchful eyes. And so disguise was both shield and curse. It protected spies from immediate death, allowed them to slip through borders and infiltrate courts, but it also forced them to live fractured lives, caught between identities, never whole, never true. They survived not as themselves, but as endless versions of others. To wear so many masks was to risk becoming hollow beneath them, a man with no face left to call his own. Yet even the most flawless disguise could not protect a spy from the corrosive solitude of his role. If he could not reveal his true self, not even in moments of intimacy, what remained of his humanity? The next burden awaiting him was not just the mask he wore, but the silence he carried, the crushing loneliness of a life where trust was impossible and companionship became the most dangerous risk of all. Silence was the invisible companion of every medieval spy, and it was heavier than any blade or chain. To survive meant learning to live without trust, without confession, without the relief of honesty. A spy could not unburden himself to a friend, a lover, or even a family member because every word carried the potential of betrayal. In a time when rumors traveled faster than horsemen, even a whisper shared in confidence could spread through villages, find its way to soldiers, and undo years of work. And so the spy built walls inside his own mind, locking his true self behind them, speaking only what was safe, showing only what was useful. This constant muting of the soul was its own kind of torture, one that did not break bones but eroded the spirit. Loneliness crept into every corner of this existence. Imagine walking into a tavern filled with music, laughter, and clattering mugs, but knowing you could never join fully. The jokes and stories exchanged around the fire were poison to a spy, because revealing too much, where you were from, who your family was, what battles you had seen, could expose the lie. Instead, you sat at the edge of the room, nodding, laughing when appropriate, drinking slowly, but never giving yourself away. Every conversation was calculated, every answer rehearsed, until even small talk became a battlefield. The spy was always present, yet never truly there, an outsider trapped in the mask of belonging. This isolation grew more dangerous in moments of vulnerability. A human heart craves connection, and spies were no different. Many sought comfort in brief encounters. Lovers met on the road, friendships formed in fleeting hours, but these ties were perilous. There are records of spies who revealed fragments of their identities in pillow talk or moments of drunken intimacy, only to be handed over to guards by the very people they trusted. One account tells of a spy in Burgundy who confessed his true mission to a woman he adored, believing her love was stronger than fear. Days later, he was dragged from her bed by soldiers, executed in the town square while she collected a reward that ensured her comfort for the rest of her days. Even when companions were loyal, the strain of silence corroded the bond. How could one build a marriage, a friendship, a brotherhood, when every story was false, every memory invented? Spies sometimes returned home after years away, only to find themselves unable to speak openly, even with their families. Their children grew up with fathers who were half strangers, men who seemed to fade into the shadows of their own houses. The work consumed not only the spy, but everyone who tried to love him. The loneliness was contagious, spreading outward until even those closest to him felt the chill of his silence. The church, which shaped so much of medieval life, added another layer of torment. Confession was sacred, a place where every soul could unburden its sins before God. But for spies, confession was dangerous. To tell the priest the truth was to risk that the secrets might leak, intentionally or not. Even priests could be informants, bound to lords or pressured by kings. And so, many spies carried their sins without release, unable to seek absolution, their guilt piling higher with each mission. The fear of damnation gnawed at them, not just fear of earthly capture, but of eternal judgment. To be damned both in this world and the next was a weight few could carry without breaking. Some spies found ways to cope with this solitude by creating rituals of secrecy. They spoke to no one, but they wrote coded journals to themselves, confessions locked in riddles that only they could understand. Others carved symbols into wood or stone, small reminders that someone had once existed behind the mask. But these fragile acts of self-preservation were dangerous too. If discovered, the writings or carvings could betray them more surely than words spoken aloud. Even attempts to ease their loneliness became potential nooses around their necks. The psychological toll was immense. Living in silence meant living in constant doubt, not only of others, but of oneself. Over time, spies began to question their own identities. If they could never speak the truth, never reveal their real names, their real thoughts, then what was left of them? Some began to fracture, slipping into madness, their invented personas taking over until they no longer knew which self was real. Chroniclers wrote of spies who returned from missions unable to answer to their birth names, who wept when asked simple questions about their childhoods. The lie had consumed the truth, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a man. And yet, silence was also a weapon. In a world where everyone wanted information, the refusal to speak was powerful. A spy who kept secrets, who never allowed his true self to surface, could become invisible, untouchable. He was a man no one fully knew, a shadow that moved through courts and markets without leaving a trace. This ability to vanish in plain sight was perhaps the spy's greatest strength, but it came at the cost of his humanity. He was no longer a man, but a mask, a role, a function. The silence that protected him also consumed him. What makes this so haunting is that the spy's greatest enemy was not always the sword, the dungeon, or the executioner. It was the slow suffocation of isolation, the erosion of self caused by years of living without honesty or trust. Many spies longed for capture, not because they wished for torture, but because at least, in those final moments, the truth could spill out, the silence could break. Death became a release from loneliness as much as from fear. But even in silence, spies sometimes found themselves drawn into the most dangerous of all games, the manipulation of kings and nobles. If the mask held, if the silence endured, they could whisper lies or truths into the ears of rulers, altering the fate of entire kingdoms with a single word. And in those moments, their solitude was not just a burden, but a weapon that could change the course of history. In the medieval world, the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity for a spy often came from the proximity to kings and nobles. To sit in the chambers of power, to whisper in the ears of rulers, was to touch the very heart of politics and war. But it was also to walk on the thinnest of blades. Nobles valued loyalty above all else, and nothing enraged them more than deceit. A single wrong word, a single piece of advice that proved false, could send a spy from the velvet cushions of a throne room to the blood-soaked stones of an execution scaffold in a matter of hours. Yet for those who mastered this deadly dance, the rewards were immense. Information was the currency of kingdoms, and those who controlled it could manipulate armies, treaties, and destinies. The spy who infiltrated the court had to be more than a liar. He had to be a performer of exquisite subtlety. Unlike disguises on the road, where coarse clothes and altered accents sufficed, court espionage required refinement. A spy had to know how to bow at the right angle, how to hold a goblet without spilling, how to flatter a lord without seeming insincere. He had to memorize genealogies, alliances, rivalries, and scandals, so that when nobles spoke of marriages, feuds, or bloodlines, he could join the conversation seamlessly. In courts where memory was power and gossip was weaponized, even the smallest hesitation could expose him. Flattery was one of the spy's most dangerous tools. To praise a king's wisdom was expected, but to praise it too much could make one appear suspicious. To laugh at a noble's joke at the wrong moment could draw attention. Court life was a theater of subtle gestures, and spies had to learn the script quickly or perish. Chroniclers tell of an English court infiltrator who won the trust of a duke by pretending to admire his hunting dogs, speaking at length of their breeding and training. Yet in that small conversation, the spy slipped coded language about military movements, phrases so carefully woven that the duke never realized he had been manipulated. It was this balancing act, truth wrapped in false admiration, that made court espionage so intoxicating and so lethal. What makes this world even more fascinating is how easily whispers could shift history. A spy who suggested that a neighboring kingdom was preparing for war could provoke a ruler into striking first, starting a conflict that otherwise might not have come. A false rumor about a noble's loyalty could lead to executions, exiles, or rebellions. In a world where written records were scarce and news traveled slowly, a single voice in a king's ear could outweigh armies of messengers. Spies wielded this power in secret, moving events like hidden hands beneath a chessboard. Yet the risk was always that someone else, another spy, another whisperer, was manipulating the same noble, pulling him in the opposite direction. The use of women in courtly espionage adds another layer of intrigue. Ladies-in-waiting mistresses and noblewomen themselves were often positioned to overhear or influence decisions. Many spies slipped into courts under the guise of servants, pouring wine at feasts or carrying trays in council chambers. From those positions, they heard secrets never meant to leave the room. Some even became confidants to queens or princesses, weaving themselves into the fabric of trust that surrounded the most powerful figures in Europe. But this role carried unique peril. Women accused of betrayal were often punished with even greater cruelty, their bodies displayed as warnings against the corruption of purity and trust. The relationship between spies and nobles was not always one of manipulation. Sometimes it was symbiotic. Kings and dukes used spies as tools to test their own courts, planning false rumors to see who would betray them, or sending agents to provoke rebellion only to crush it afterward. In this way, spies became both pawns and players, used by their masters, while also using those same masters to further their own agendas. But such games were unstable, and a spy who believed himself indispensable often discovered too late that he was expendable. The paranoia of court life ensured that spies were never safe, even when successful. Nobles were notorious for sudden turns of suspicion. A trusted advisor one day could be accused of treason the next, and the punishment was swift. Spies lived with the knowledge that the very kings they served could become their executioners. One Venetian report tells of a man who fed intelligence to a duke for years, shaping battles and alliances in his favor. When the duke finally discovered the man's duplicity, he ordered him strangled with his own silken sash, remarking coldly that he had given him enough rope to hang himself. Such stories reveal how fragile the position of the spy truly was in the glittering but dangerous halls of power. What is most haunting about espionage at this level is the intimacy of the betrayal. To manipulate strangers on the road was one thing, but to look into the eyes of a ruler who believed in your loyalty and deceive him daily required a soul hardened against conscience. Each bow, each toast, each smile at a feast was layered with lies. The spy became not only an observer, but a puppeteer, pulling strings that could topple dynasties. But the closer he came to the heart of power, the more dangerous every move became, until the tension itself was unbearable. The manipulation of kings and nobles was perhaps the highest art of espionage, but it was also the most perilous. For spies, it was not enough to survive the roads, the disguises, and the betrayals of comrades. Once they entered the gilded chambers of power, they entered a place where suspicion was sharper than steel, and where the price of failure was not only death, but death delivered in the most public, humiliating ways imaginable. And, if they managed to endure, to keep their secrets and their masks intact, there remained another torment waiting in the shadows, the psychological warfare of living constantly under fear, where the body was tortured not only by iron, but by the mind itself. The true battlefield of the medieval spy was not always the dungeon or the execution square. It was the mind. To live constantly on guard, hidden beneath disguises, wrapped in silence, and suffocated by suspicion, was to carry a torment that ate away at the soul. This psychological torture did not require chains or fire. It lived in sleepless nights, in the gnawing fear of betrayal, in the erosion of identity that came from playing too many roles for too long. Spies were trained to expect physical pain if captured, but the mental strain of their work was something far more insidious, something that hollowed them out long before the first blade ever touched their flesh. Consider the simple act of sleeping. For ordinary men, rest was a refuge, a release from the burdens of the day. For a spy, it was the most dangerous state of all. Sleep meant losing control, letting the tongue loosen, the body twitch, the breath betray secrets. Some spies forced themselves to sleep in short bursts, never longer than a few minutes, training their bodies to wake at the smallest sound. Others tied ropes to their wrists so that the tug of movement would wake them if they spoke or stirred too much. Over time, this fractured rest shattered their minds. They lived half awake, half dreaming, caught in a fog where reality blurred with paranoia. The torture was invisible, but it was relentless. There was also the agony of double life. A spy might spend months, even years, inhabiting a false identity, until the mask fused with his skin. He smiled at neighbors who thought he was a humble craftsman, played dice with soldiers who believed him to be a loyal comrade, dined with nobles who trusted him as a servant of their cause. Yet beneath every smile was the knowledge that none of it was real. The friendships, the laughter, the bonds of daily life, all were illusions, and he could never allow himself to truly believe in them. This constant pretending corroded the spirit. Many spies returned from missions unable to connect with their own families, unable to tell stories without slipping into lies, unable to remember who they had once been. The pressure of silence turned into madness for some. Without the ability to confess, to share, to unburden, the mind twisted in on itself. Some spies began speaking to themselves in riddles, creating imaginary companions who would listen when no human could. Others scratched symbols into walls or trees, desperate to leave proof that they existed at all. Chroniclers recorded stories of men who, after years of service, broke suddenly in public, screaming secrets into crowded marketplaces, their sanity shattered by the crushing weight of holding too much inside. In such cases, their lives ended swiftly, but the true executioner had not been the sword or the gallows. It had been their own fractured mind. Guilt also played its part. A spy's work was built on betrayal. To succeed meant deceiving, lying, and often condemning others to death. Even if the enemy was faceless, the spy often saw the human cost of his actions. Villages burned because of leaked information, soldiers ambushed because of whispered reports, families destroyed because of accusations planted in the right ears. To carry such guilt without confession was unbearable. Some turned to prayer, begging God for forgiveness, even as they prepared for their next deception. Others drowned themselves in drink, using ale and wine to numb the gnawing sense that their souls were rotting with every lie. But nothing erased the truth that their victories were bought with the lives of men who never knew their names. And then there was fear, the constant, suffocating fear that stalked every step. The fear of capture, of torture, of execution was obvious, but the deeper fear was more intimate. The fear of being seen. A spy who walked into a marketplace carried the terror that one familiar face would recognize him, that one sharp-eyed child would tug at a parent's sleeve and whisper that the stranger's story did not fit. This kind of fear was not a single moment, but a constant hum, a vibration in the bones that never faded. Living with it was like standing always at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. Even success did not free spies from psychological torment. To survive a mission, to return with the information, did not bring peace. Instead, it often brought only the next assignment, the next disguise, the next silence. Each mission stacked upon the last, building weight upon weight until the soul bent under the burden. The spy could never exhale, never release the tension, because survival today meant nothing if failure came tomorrow. This endless cycle trapped them in a life that was less existence than endurance, a slow unraveling of mind and spirit. Some spies found themselves envying the openly condemned. A knight executed in battle was remembered as a hero, his name carved into songs and chronicles. A spy, however, who managed to live through decades of service was often buried in anonymity, his sacrifices erased from history. This invisibility was its own form of torment, to give everything, to suffer beyond measure, and to know that no one would ever remember or honor the cost. To exist as a ghost while still alive was the cruelest form of psychological torture, and it drove many into despair. And yet, despite the toll, men and women continued to step into the shadows, knowing full well that the work would destroy them from within. For in their silence, in their loneliness, in their fractured minds, they carried not only the burden of survival, but the power to shape the fates of kingdoms. But if the torment of the mind was unbearable, the torment of the body was even more so, for when the silence finally broke, and spies were dragged into the light, their suffering was no longer hidden, but turned into public spectacle. Their deaths designed to terrify and instruct all who watched. Public punishment was the medieval stage where spies met their final humiliation, and it was as much performance as it was execution. Unlike soldiers who died in the chaos of battle or nobles who were quietly dispatched in private chambers, captured spies were paraded before the crowd, their deaths transformed into a warning etched into memory. The aim was not simply to end a life, but to strip away dignity, to brand the body with dishonor, and to remind all who watched that betrayal and secrecy would never escape justice. In this theater of cruelty, the spy was not just killed, he was unmade. Executions often began with a display meant to erode the prisoner's humanity. Spies were marched through the streets, bound in chains, while guards announced their crimes to the masses. Town criers shouted accusations of treachery, and children hurled stones as the condemned passed. The humiliation was deliberate, designed to make the spy an object of scorn before the actual punishment began. In some cases, placards were hung around their necks declaring them liars or traitors, ensuring that even strangers knew the depth of their disgrace. This ritual was part of the sentence, for in the medieval mind, a spy's death was not only about justice, but about spectacle, about feeding the community's hunger to see deceit punished. The methods of execution were chosen for their horror and symbolism. Hanging was common, but unlike the swift drops of later centuries, medieval hangings were slow strangulations, where the body kicked and twisted for long minutes before finally going still. Burning at the stake was another favored method, especially for spies accused of using disguises tied to false faith. Fire was seen as purifying, burning away the deceit and sending the soul to judgment. Beheading was reserved for those of noble blood, but even then, a spy's execution was made messy, with dull blades or unskilled executioners prolonging the agony. And in the most brutal cases, spies were quartered, drawn apart by horses or dismembered piece by piece to ensure that no part of their body remained whole. These punishments were not carried out in silence. Crowds gathered in town squares drawn by the promise of violence, the chance to witness the raw edge of power. Children perched on rooftops, merchants paused their trade, and peasants came from nearby villages, all to watch the unraveling of one man. The executioner's blows were often accompanied by sermons from priests, reminding the crowd that betrayal was not just treason against kings, but sin against God. Thus, the spy's death was made into a moral lesson. His screams turned into an echo of divine judgment. The audience left not only entertained, but warned, their loyalty reinforced through fear. What is chilling is how communities participated in these spectacles. People who had never known the spy would jeer and curse, eager to see his suffering. They spat upon him, hurled insults, sometimes even demanded harsher punishments from the authorities. It was as though the very presence of a traitor corrupted the air, and only his destruction could cleanse it. For the spy, this was a deeper torment than chains or fire. To die hated by strangers, to feel humanity itself turned against you, was to taste a loneliness sharper than any blade. The public became executioners long before the axe fell, there were also calculated theatrics meant to heighten the dread. Sometimes spies were forced to confess publicly before death, naming comrades or detailing their crimes. Others were mutilated beforehand, ears cut off, tongues torn out, fingers broken, to ensure their suffering was not only heard but seen. Chroniclers tell of a captured messenger in Flanders whose eyelids were removed before execution so that he could not close his eyes against the horror of the crowd's jeers. Each added cruelty was not accidental but orchestrated, designed to magnify fear and to leave unforgettable images in the minds of those who watched. And yet, despite all of this, some spies used their final moments to turn the stage back against their captors. Accounts exist of prisoners who shouted lies in their last breaths, planting seeds of suspicion among nobles, or who cursed kings and lords so loudly that their words lived on in rumor. A few even laughed in the face of their deaths, embracing the fire or the rope as though to show that the rulers had failed to break their spirit. These acts of defiance were rare, but they lingered in whispers, haunting the very rulers who had sought to make examples of them. In this way, the spy's death became not only an ending, but a weapon of its own. The executions were never solely about justice, they were about power. Kings and lords staged them to remind their people who commanded life and death, who defined loyalty and treason. To watch a spy burn was to watch the invisible hand of authority made flesh, a spectacle that turned terror into obedience. But there was a darker irony beneath it all. The more violently spies were punished, the more others were driven into secrecy, fueled by fear but also by anger at the cruelty of their rulers. The very act meant to extinguish espionage sometimes fanned its flames. The legacy of these punishments lived long after the fires cooled and the gallows were empty. Villagers told their children of the screaming traitors they had seen, priests used the stories in sermons, and rulers invoked the memories when speaking of loyalty. The spy's death did not vanish. It became legend, a tale told and retold to harden hearts against deceit. But if the body was destroyed in public, what of the memory of the spy himself? Unlike knights whose names filled ballads, spies were erased, forgotten, their lives stripped of honor and story. Their anonymity was as much a punishment as the noose. And yet, in this silence of memory, another truth lingered. For while their names disappeared, the impact of their work remained. Wars were shifted, alliances broken, battles lost or won because of secrets carried by men who died unremembered. Their deaths may have been public, humiliating and cruel, but their shadows still shaped history in ways the executioner could never erase. And it is in those shadows, forgotten yet essential, that we find the final torment and paradox of the spy's life. The knowledge that even in death, their secrets still lived, waiting to be inherited by those who came after them. The tragedy of the medieval spy was not only in how he lived or how he died, but in how little of him remained afterward. Unlike knights who earned songs or kings who filled chronicles, spies were deliberately erased from history. Their names were scratched out, their deeds concealed, their very existence swallowed by silence. Theirs was a legacy built not in light, but in shadow, where even success meant anonymity and only failure left a visible mark. They shaped the fate of kingdoms, yet their reward was to vanish into oblivion. This erasure was intentional. Rulers depended on spies, yet they rarely acknowledged them publicly. To admit the use of espionage was to reveal weakness, to confess reliance on deceit rather than valor. Kings wanted to be remembered as victorious warriors, not as schemers whispering in shadows. And so the names of spies were omitted from chronicles, their stories left untold. Their letters were burned, their reports hidden away in secret archives. When a mission succeeded, the glory was given to generals and nobles. When it failed, the spy was blamed, punished, and forgotten. The double injustice was that their sacrifices shaped history, yet their presence was denied in its telling. Still, faint traces of their existence survive in curious places. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, a strange symbol may hide a code. In the ruins of castles, secret passageways hint at couriers slipping unseen through walls. In the whispered stories of villages, tales of strangers who appeared and disappeared without a trace remind us of the shadows that once passed among them. These fragments are like ghostly fingerprints, reminders that behind every great event there were eyes watching, hands carrying messages, and voices whispering lies or truths that changed the world. One haunting reality is that many spies did not even live to see the fruits of their work. A message might reach a king and alter the outcome of a war, but the man who carried it might already be rotting in an unmarked grave. Others who lived long enough to complete their missions often found themselves discarded afterward, abandoned by the masters they had served so loyally. To be a spy was to accept disposability. You were valuable only as long as you carried secrets. Once those secrets were delivered, you became a liability, a loose thread to be cut away. And yet, there was a strange kind of immortality in the consequences of their actions. A war avoided, a siege launched, a rebellion crushed. These turning points were born not on the battlefield, but in the clandestine work of men and women who were never named. Consider the fall of castles that opened their gates to friendly visitors who were, in truth, infiltrators. or the alliances shattered by rumors planted at the right moment. These events entered history as acts of fate, but behind them were spies, whose names were deliberately forgotten. Their legacy is hidden in the outcomes, not the credit. And the most chilling aspect of this forgotten legacy is how it mirrors the life they lived. Just as spies survive by erasing themselves, by wearing masks and becoming others, so too were they erased in death. They spent their lives pretending to be people they were not, and in the end, history pretended they had never been at all. Their very survival depended on invisibility, and invisibility became their epitaph. This symmetry is cruel but fitting. They lived as shadows, and they remained shadows in memory. But perhaps the silence surrounding their lives was the ultimate weapon. A knight might inspire loyalty with his courage, a king with his crown, but a spy's true power lay in uncertainty. No one could ever be sure if a spy had been there at all, if a decision was made because of truth or manipulation, if a victory belonged to strategy or to deceit whispered in the right ear. This ambiguity continues to haunt the way we remember the Middle Ages. For every recorded battle, there may have been an unrecorded whisper that made it possible. For every celebrated king, there may have been an unknown spy who carved his path to power. It is tempting to imagine that some spies found peace in anonymity, that they accepted being forgotten as the price of service. But the human heart longs for recognition, and the absence of remembrance was its own cruelty. To suffer, to sacrifice, to live in silence, and then to be erased, it was as though their lives had been nothing more than smoke on the wind. And yet, that smoke shaped the world. The irony is that the more they were forgotten, the more vital they truly were. When we peer into the dim corners of medieval history, when we notice the gaps, the unexplained turns, the sudden betrayals or unexpected victories, we are glimpsing the outlines of their work. Their names may be gone, but their fingerprints linger in every mystery that history left unsolved. They remind us that power is not always held by the men who stand in the light, but often by those who moved unseen in the dark. And so the legacy of the medieval spy is not one of monuments or songs, but of shadows. They were erased to protect the illusions of honor and glory, yet without them, kingdoms would have collapsed, battles would have ended differently, and rulers would have fallen. Their curse was anonymity, but their gift was influence. They lived and died in silence, but their silence still speaks, echoing in the spaces where history stumbles and whispers of secrets yet untold. And it is in those echoes that the final truth lies. The spy's life was not wasted, only hidden, waiting for those daring enough to listen to the shadows.